Welcome to everyone, and welcome back to those of you who attended our last session, our first session last week. If you missed last week's session, don't worry. We've posted a recording on the Development Initiatives website under the events page. We'll also be recording this session, and I'll be providing a link to where you can find this at the end of the presentation. I'm pleased to see that we have about 17 organisations participating this week, many different stakeholder groups, some government donors, quite a few UN agencies, multilaterals, and a number of national and international non-governmental organisations. So let's get started. Today we'll be talking about how to get started on publishing your humanitarian aid data to the IATI Standard. So to reintroduce ourselves on the next slide, thanks Wendy. I'm Liz, a consultant with Development Initiatives working on the project Monitoring the Grand Bargain Transparency Commitment, and I'll be co-hosting the session with Wendy, who's IATI's Senior Business and Data Analyst. Hi Wendy.
Hi Liz, hi everyone.
The session will last approximately 1 hour in total, and we've split it into 5 parts and tried to ensure that there are a number of opportunities to ask questions throughout the session. So as we're running through the presentation, please do send us your questions in the questions box in your screen. You'll see this by clicking, I think it's on the 4th grey arrow in your GoToWebinar control box. And we'll try to respond to as many questions as we can, but for those we don't have time to answer, we'll send out a link to the responses alongside the recording next week. For those of you dialing in by phone, and I know a number of you are, Wendy and I will signal when we're moving from one slide to the next, so hopefully you'll be able to follow virtually on the slides. So if we move on to the agenda here, in the first part of this session, we'll provide a brief publishing overview on what IATI is and the mechanics of publishing. Then the second part of the presentation will explain in greater depth what kind of information is required and highlighting the humanitarian elements that were introduced in the version 2.02 of the IATI Standard. Section 3 will cover publishing tools and the support available to publishers, and the final part will explore publisher monitoring, why it's important, and how we plan to support organisations as part of the Grand Bargain project on monitoring the transparency commitment. And finally, we'll take some final questions and look at next steps. So Wendy, over to you and the next slide.
Okay, thank you very much, Liz, and hello to everyone again. Good to have you joining us today. So hopefully most of you who've joined us will have either watched or were on the first webinar that we did last week, so you have a basic sort of understanding of what IATI is, or maybe you're already working with IATI and are joining just to know a little bit more, but that's absolutely fine. So first of all, very quick recap about what IATI actually is. IATI really essentially revolves around the IATI Standard. And the purpose of the IATI Standard is essentially to define an international standard for the formatting for publishing aid-related information, which essentially is open source, so essentially is available to everyone. The IATI Standard is a multi-stakeholder initiative, so we have a very wide-ranging community of different types of organisations who are involved, and currently it remains a voluntary publishing standard, so a lot of the decisions about publishing still fall to the data publisher. But the main thing really to remember is very much that IATI is an initiative and not, as is commonly sort of misunderstood, that it's an IT system. To say that the very sort of centre of IATI is very much around the management and the use of the standard. Also, just a quick recap really in terms of the mechanics of publishing. So if you become an IATI publisher, essentially what that means is your organisation will be producing XML files that contain data about your various projects or programs or interventions, and they'll be in an XML format, and that's as per the specification defined by the IATI Standard. There are two types of file, an organisation and an activity file, and a lot of this presentation will be looking at, in more detail, at the information that you will include in those two different types of data sets. So in terms of how that information is produced, there's two main routes. Essentially, some mostly larger publishers will tend to write or produce their own applications that pull the required data from their internal IT systems and format up the organization and activity files as required, and effectively to make them available to the wider public domain. Smaller or medium-sized organisations tend to use online IT publishing tools such as AidStream, and again we're going to look a little bit more at some of the publishing tools and what they're able to provide a little bit further on in this session. The main sort of thing to understand is that once those files have been produced, they are not given to us, they're not given to IATI to manage. The data and the data files should always remain essentially under the control of the data publisher. So those that publish from their own systems with their own applications will, we encourage those publishers to host them on their own web servers in terms of maintaining that integrity of the data. And similarly, those using online tools, the data generally resides on the publishing tool platform. But what we do need of our publishers is they create an account on the IATI registry, and then within that IATI registry, within your account, you create a number of what we call data sets, which include the various URL links to all of the IATI XML files that have been created. So essentially the registry is exactly that. It's a register that includes those sort of pointers via the URLs to wherever IATI published data is, wherever it exists, or wherever it is located across the globe. So let's move on to find out a little bit more now about what information is published. So I've already mentioned there are two different types of XML file that a publisher can produce. In terms of the organisation file, as its name suggests, this generally contains a lot of budgetary information, really at the level of the organisation. So it's also around providing that forward-looking data that a lot of our data users have traditionally wanted to use and to know about. So within the organisational file, you can provide your sort of top-level organisational budgets, in terms of looking over as many years in advance as you are able to do, as your budgeting process allows. And those budgets can be broken down in terms of countries or regions. So you might be able to publish, how much you estimate will be spent in Tanzania over the next 3 years. And similarly, you can do the same thing for a region as well. You can also actually provide budgets in terms of estimates per organisation. So if you work closely with certain organisations, you can actually provide those forward-looking budgets for the specific organisation. So if you're going to work with the World Food Programme, for instance, you can actually publish in advance your sort of estimates of how much money you'll be potentially transferring to them in the next however many years. Similarly, you can include links, URL links as well, to strategic documents. So this might be things like your annual report or any sort of relevant document that you might hold on your website or again somewhere accessible via the internet that contains information about your organisation and that is relevant to your various operations. We're not going to look anymore too closely at the rest of the data in the organisation file, but a lot of the focus today is going to be much more on the content of the activity file, because this is where the bulk of the data that you'll publish will be held. And particularly some of our larger publishers, can publish a great many number of activity files just to cover the huge amount of projects and programs and interventions they're involved with. So as we go through, we'll see that an activity file will, when we look at the activity file, we'll see that the activities will have descriptions and dates. We'll see about how we provide information about who's involved with a particular activity. We'll look at the financial transactions. So the financial tracking of IATI is a core part or a core feature of the IATI Standard, and certainly one of the most utilised parts that data users are interested in. We'll also look at how you can do geographic coding, so at sort of higher level, regional, country or subnational. As Liz has already alluded to, obviously we'll cover the humanitarian information that was added at the most recent version of the standard, which is version 2.02. And we'll also cover off as well results, which we know is getting a lot of attention at the moment. There's a lot of focus and in terms of getting all of our publishers to provide good results information. And also as well about what we call activity level budgets. So this is really the forward-looking elements for a particular activity in terms of, again, providing that sort of spend profile of any money that's been allocated to it. So before a publisher can even begin to actually start publishing, the one thing that every organisation that publishes to IATI needs is a unique organisation identifier. So not unsurprisingly, as with most IT systems, when you're publishing to IATI, we need a way of uniquely identifying all of the organisations that are reporting and publishing data. There is currently no international system that is available to provide a unique reference for companies and organisations across the world. So this has been devised as part of the IATI Standard. And in terms of how it's constructed, it's made up of 3 parts, as you can see on the slide. So the first part is the country ISO code, and that will relate to the country that the organisation that is publishing is located in or is operating in. The second part is an abbreviation that relates to a registration organisation. So a registration organisation would be a formal organisation within the country where that organisation is operating, where that particular, the NGO or the multilateral or the organisation needs to be registered. So it generally would be considered part of the country's governance structure, for instance. So the example that we have here on this slide with the COH relates to Companies House, which is the UK's registration body for all companies, obviously, that are operating in the UK. And then the last part of the identifier is the registration number that has been allocated to the publishing organisation by the registration organisation. So the example that we have here, the GBCOH 6368740, is that of development initiatives. So that last bit, the number, the 06368740 part, is actually the number that were given from Companies House. That's our registration number. So, and also, if in order to find out if we've already got some of these registration organisations set up, you can use the link on the bottom of the slide, which will take you to the list, which actually makes up part of the IATI Standard, where we already have registered a whole number of registration organisations. So you can look up wherever you are in the world to see if we already have a particular registration organisation you might be registered with that you can use in terms of constructing your organisation identifier in order to publish. So once you've got your organisation identifier, it's then a case of thinking about your activities and actually the core information you're going to be publishing. We talk about activities in IATI essentially, and that is a sort of generic unit of aid, and it's very much, as I think we mentioned in the first webinar, it's down to the publisher to decide what your appropriate unit of aid or your activity would be. Many publishers will use projects or programs, but essentially it has to be something that obviously works for your particular operational business model and relates to how you manage your own interventions and your own projects within your own organisation. So once you've decided on what your activity is going to be, you can start providing the information about a specific activity. So for a typical sort of humanitarian activity might be in terms of providing some sort of food assistance or relief to some refugees in a certain location, for instance. And the core information around that activities that we would want to see, and from the IATI Standard perspective, is very much we would want a title and description. So the title would be a one-line sort of short overview definition of what the activity is for or doing, and then the description is obviously a more fuller definition or description of what the project or the activity is actually setting out to achieve. Similarly as well, we would ask for dates. So we would ask for the start date and the end date, if known, of the particular activity. You can also publish planned start dates or planned end dates, which provides additional information if you don't actually know at that point. If a project is still in planning, for instance, you might use a planned start date, or if you've got an open-ended project, you might use a planned end date if you think it's going to run for a certain number of years but you're not sure. And also we have the status field, which really just denotes whether the activity is still in planning, or as we would call it, pipeline, if it's in implementation, if it's actually still in progress, or if it's moved into a post-delivery phase or effectively has finished. So moving on to the next slide, I'm going to talk about who's involved. So when you are describing who else is involved with you in terms of your particular activities, in IATI terms, we talk about participating organisations. And the information that we look to get our publishers to include is the role of others that might be working with you. So, you know, if you're partnering with an organisation, or obviously another organisation is perhaps funding you. So we want to understand the sort of relationships between the other organisations that you're involved with. And there are currently 4 main roles in terms of how that can be described. Funding, as I say, you know, obviously if they're providing monies for the project. Implementing, if they're perhaps doing some of the delivery of the project in the field itself, and also extending and accountable. So these are quite often used when you have an organisation who may not necessarily be funding you directly or delivering the project, but perhaps have an oversight requirement on the project, or involved in some other sort of capacity, some other sort of oversight or governance capacity. We also like to know the type of organisation. That's obviously useful to data users in terms of, you know, are they a government institution? Are they multilateral? You know, is it another NGO? And similarly as well, if they're already publishing to IATI themselves, then, you know, we would very much encourage the use of their organisation identifier to uniquely reference them. The organisation identifier becomes very important when you have large federated organisations, for instance. So, for instance, like World Vision International, who obviously have lots of country offices around the world. So, and if they are all publishing individually, so if World Vision International is publishing and World Vision Senegal and Bangladesh, each of those institutes, each of those country offices can each have their own unique organisation identifier. So this obviously helps in terms of the participating organisation information, because you can actually say, well, I'm not just working with World Vision, I'm working with World Vision Bangladesh or wherever, whichever country office is relevant. And similarly, the organisation name as well. And again, it's useful to put that sort of extra, rather than just putting something like World Vision or Plan International. It's always useful to actually put the specific country office if it's relevant. So if we move on to the next slide, we're going to now talk about geographic information. So you can provide geographic information via the IATI Standard, sort of at 3 levels of granularity. You can provide the recipient country. So this is the country that the project will be taking place in. And in fact, if there are multiple countries, you can obviously provide all of the names of the countries where the work is taking place. If you provide more than one country, then the standard requires that you provide a percentage amount against that country to really give a sort of indication of how much of the effort is going into the various sort of interventions within each country. And we don't necessarily need you to agonise over those percentages. You know, we're looking really for sort of something there or thereabouts, really, to give an indication of the effort. I mean, if you can do it exactly, that's brilliant. But just to let you know that you don't have to agonise to the nth degree to go down to sort of very small percentage values. Similarly, you can do the same with regions. You can say that this particular intervention is being rolled out or being delivered in a particular region. And again, you can also include multiple regions using the percentage value as well. But probably the biggest ask that we get from all of our data users is for publishers to provide, wherever possible, the subnational information. So this is very much, you know, that subnational, the details of actually the very specifics of where an intervention may be being delivered. So, can you provide the longitude, latitude coordinates of the location where work is actually taking place, maybe the administrative area. We also have various links to gazetteers, so different coding standards effectively that you can use in order to help supplement and to provide that additional subnational location data. So we move on now to the humanitarian information. So as we've said, this was added at the most recent version of the standards with 2.02. We know that a lot of publishers are already publishing humanitarian information, and those of them that are using older versions of the standard. But it's obviously not easy to actually find that information, which was one of the main drivers for being able to add these elements so that that information can be found explicitly from within the entire IATI data set. So in terms of the elements that are currently available, we have a humanitarian marker. So this is literally just a flag that you can add to your specific activities to indicate that it's a humanitarian activity. We very much recognise there's no general recognized definition for what constitutes a humanitarian activity, so we always leave it up to the publisher to decide in terms of their own internal rules or guidelines or business rules or whatever. So it's left to the publisher to decide whether an activity is tagged with that humanitarian marker or not. Similarly, we now have the element that allows you to relate a specific activity to an emergency or crisis. This was probably one of the biggest challenges we had when we introduced these elements, because there's currently no single list of emergencies that exists sort of anywhere across the humanitarian community. There's no one institution that holds a list of every single recognized crises that's going on in the world at any given time. And actually that still, in some respects, remains a little bit of a problem and something that we'll have to look at in terms of the sort of future development of the standard. However, for the moment you can use, some of you may be familiar with the GLIDE database. And for those of you that aren't, the GLIDE database was essentially originally set up to record instances of all natural disasters. So it is a managed database and would have held originally information about earthquakes, typhoons, any sort of natural disaster. However, in recent time, it has been the scope of what is added to GLIDE is now much, much wider, and it does include references within it in terms of things such as the Syrian refugee crisis, Ebola, and pretty much does cover a great deal of the sort of emergencies that are recognised as being in progress. So what you can now do within the standard is to use the code that represents that emergency from within the GLIDE database and then include it in your IATI publishing to say, this activity relates to the Nepal earthquake in 2015. And then by including the various GLIDE reference for the Nepal earthquake. There are some issues with the way that GLIDE is set up. The main issues around the way it's currently used is that emergencies are added on a by year and by country level. So this means that if you have an emergency, say such as Ebola, which obviously happened in a number of countries, you therefore have to add the GLIDE code that may relate to the number of the relevant countries that you were working in. So we have one publisher who has provided that information, and they were working in 3 different countries, so they had to include the 3 different GLIDE codes to cover Sierra Leone and Guinea and the other country they were in. Similarly as well, because GLIDE is on a yearly codes are added on an annual basis, if you did have a multi-year emergency you relate to, you potentially have to add the codes for the various years that your intervention would relate to. You can also include information as to whether this activity relates to an appeal, as well as a humanitarian plan. So this is very much linked to, obviously, UN OCHA's FTS system. So it's useful for them to know that if you, as a government entity, were making a contribution to a specific UN appeal, you can include that information. And this is all part and parcel of making the IATI data usable so that the OCHA FTS system can automatically import that IATI data. And this is one of the projects that's currently being worked on with a view to ultimately being able to just import any IATI data that's provided, so organisations wouldn't then have to report separately to FTS in terms of any contributions or relief efforts that they're working on. And finally as well, and similar to that as well, also a sort of request to assist with the FTS integration. You can actually provide UN cluster information as well. So if you know that, if your particular intervention is to do with food assistance, then you can reference the food and nutrition cluster, or similarly if it's a WASH intervention, you can obviously relate it to the WASH UN cluster as well. And like we saw with the geographic coding, like with regions and countries, you can obviously use a percentage value if it's obviously related to more than one UN cluster. The results information, we'll just move on to look at the results and performance information. So I think we've already mentioned that the results is currently getting a lot of interest, and there's a lot of work and focus on the results part of the IATI standard at the moment. There is a lot of drive now to get publishers providing good results information for the work that they do. And results can be published in terms of outputs or outcomes or impacts. So you have different levels of granularity of reporting that are available. You can report your KPIs, your key performance indicators, and we very much are now encouraging publishers to, when they first publish an activity, to include their KPIs, their indicators at the beginning of their project, so we can see the measures, so data users can see the measures essentially of how that project is being assessed, or in terms of the improvements that it's aiming to achieve. And then across the life cycle of that project, it's good to see periodic sort of updates of those measures. So maybe at the beginning you provide the baseline measure for your KPI, and then follow that up perhaps with what your target measure is, and then the actuals as you're measuring it across across the period that the project is running. And obviously as well, you can make sure that those measurements can, you can specify the time period that those measurements are relevant to as well. Okay, just move on now to look at transactions. So the financial information is obviously, as I said previously, a very core part of the IATI standard. And I think a lot of people think that IATI is just about the financial elements, even though, as we've seen, it's actually much wider than that. But we've always encouraged our publishers to provide transactional information. We look at that financial information in terms of these transactions, and we have various different types of transactions that we ask publishers to provide. So incoming fund would relate to monies that are paid to your organisation from an external entity or organisation. So if you have money you receive money perhaps from a UN agency or the government, or you would report that payment that's made to you as an incoming fund transaction. And similarly, if you then subsequently make a payment on to perhaps one of your partner organisations in country, or to perhaps one of your country offices, you would show that transfer of money, that payment, as a disbursement transaction. You can also show what we call expenditure transactions, and this, you might show an expenditure transaction if you were to buy some equipment. Sometimes as well we say to publishers that if perhaps you're paying another entity who themselves are probably unlikely to publish to IATI, so perhaps you've got some one-off consultancy or some specialised consultancy, for instance, you might show the cost of that consultancy by just using an expenditure rather than a disbursement transaction. It's probably worth me mentioning as well the importance of the commitment transaction. So the commitment, although it's described and managed as a transaction by the IATI standard, obviously it relates to the decision that's made in the real world. So when an organisation commits or decides to spend £10 million to a particular project, they can show that decision via the IATI standard by publishing a commitment transaction. So it's obviously not a real transaction in the sense that you wouldn't be able to look at your bank balance, your bank statement, to see a particular transaction, but it is a way of showing how that decision is made, or what that decision has been made, and for how much the commitment is that has been made to a particular project. We also, on a transaction, you can actually include the provider and receiver information. So this is the provider is the person who is providing the funds. So on an incoming fund transaction, that would be the organisation that's giving you the money. And the receiver, well, that would be the organisation itself, because you would be receiving the money, the money from the funding organisation. And similarly, it would be the other way around on a disbursement. So if you're making a payment to another organisation, your organisation would be the provider, and then the organisation that's receiving the money would be the receiver. And the reason we ask organisations to provide this money, because you might think, well, wouldn't they be able to work that out from the participating organisation, is because having this information on the transaction is the way that we are able to enable the traceability through the funding and delivery chains within the IATI standard. So it's only really by having this core information, the traceability is managed through the transaction data. I don't propose to talk more about traceability on this particular session, because it probably requires a session on its own, standing on its own, but it's just important to understand why we need that information. And finally, as you would expect with a transaction, we obviously want to know the value of the transaction. So how much was the transaction for? 5 million, 10 million, at the date the transaction was made, and basically the baseline sort of currency that the transaction was made in. Okay, I'm just going to move on now to classifications and just talk very briefly. There's a number of classifications that you can use within the IATI standard, and these are obviously very useful for making the entire IATI data set useful to data users. If all data users, all data publishers rather, are using the same classification, it makes it much easier for a data user to go and find all of the information that they may be looking for. So the sorts of classifications we have are obviously sector codes. So is this a health project, an education project? We encourage publishers, we ask publishers to use the DAC sector codes. So these are the sector codes that come from the OEC DAC. They're a very comprehensive, a long list of sector codes that you can use, going to quite a low level of granularity. But obviously, if everyone is using the same sector codes, then as I say, it's much easier for a data user to find, all the projects that are relevant to, say, health or primary education, or whichever of the sector codes they're interested in. And similarly, you can provide other information around collaboration types, so who you're working with in terms of how the financing for this particular intervention is made, flow type, what sort of funding is this? Is it from ODA? Is it private grant? Again, we have various lists that can describe the different flow types, and finance types as well. So is this payment being made as a grant? Is it being made as a loan? Is it an investment? So there's lots of sort of additional information, particularly around the financial transaction side, that you can provide. So just going on to the next slide now to talk about just some other financial information that can also be provided. So I talked about budgets, and this is specifically activity budgets. So this is where you're able to provide for a particular intervention. If it's a multi-year project or program, you can actually provide your sort of predicted spend profile for that project by the use of the activity budget. So if it's a £5 million project running over 3 years, you can provide an activity budget to show that 2 million will be spent in the first year, 1 million in the second, and then the remaining 2 million in the third, or whatever is relevant. And again, this is part of the forward-looking information that our original data user set are very interested in terms of seeing for budgeting and planning purposes. And similarly as well, you have some interventions where some contractual arrangements where payments are actually mapped out as part of the contract. So you know that you're going to be making payments to your partners at particular points throughout the contract lifetime. So these can be actually managed and published as planned disbursements. So if you know when you're going to make the payment, you can actually provide that information at the very start of when you're first publishing details about an activity. So just in terms of, obviously that was a very quick skim through in terms of what the IATI standard covers, and I know that, you know, from working with publishers on a day-to-day basis, when each publisher goes back and starts looking at these elements of the standard in relation to their own operation, there will always be questions that need to be asked and things that they're not sure how to do. So just want to reassure you all that there is plenty of support available. So we have the central IATI help desk, and there's also some online guidance on the IATI website. That email address, support@iatistandard.org, is the email for the help desk, and I would certainly suggest that if you have any IATI specific queries, you just use that email to send a request, and whatever your question is, to the help desk, and myself and my colleagues will hope to get back to you and provide you with an answer. We also have the technical advisory group. So this is essentially the user group of the entire IATI community. We certainly encourage all of our publishers, all data users, to become part of the community. I did say at the beginning, you know, reminder that IATI is a multi-stakeholder standard. So, you know, it's not about us at the centre saying this is how things are going to be done. It's very much a community-led initiative. You know, that's why we want to work with the community to make sure that we take issues on board in terms of managing the IATI standard and looking at future enhancements and upgrades to the standard. The TAG has an annual conference. It's actually taking place next week in Tanzania. So we've got nearly 200 people coming together in Tanzania just to talk sort of 4 days of IATI. So definitely, for all of you interested, definitely encourage you thinking about that for maybe future years if you're not coming this year. We have an online discussion forum. Again, anyone is free to post. You can post a question to the community to say, how do other organisations do this? You know, what in this situation, you know, what do publishers do? Or I'm a data user, how can I use? Freely available, and it's quite active. If you go on and look at the various discussions that are taking place, quite active on the forums. And you can also subscribe to the TAG newsletter, which is a fortnightly email that comes out just to keep you up to date with all things IATI. Okay, so I've done a lot of talking, so I don't know, Liz, have we got some questions that need answering?
We have indeed. Dale, I don't know if you can click down and maybe try and get Dale online. He's got a great question about non-profits using the IATI standard.
Okay,
so can you
while I just find
him?
Dale. Okay, okay. Dale, I've just unmuted you if you want to ask the question for all the attendees.
Okay, I'm not sure how this works. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, I'm actually female. Yes, I'm just curious if this is being used by nonprofits and to what extent, what percentage you would say, because it does seem it would be quite burdensome. And although, you know, we all want to help the world, you know, there many nonprofits would prefer to do rather than to record.
Sure, no, thank you for that, Dale, and apologies. We have a male Dale that works with us as well, so apologies for that confusion. No, that's a very good question, and it comes up a lot. I mean, we certainly recognise that for smaller organisations, reporting to IATI can sometimes seem quite daunting and quite a big task, and particularly in small organisations which have very limited resources. We do actually have a large number of smaller NGOs that publish. Admittedly, a fair number of these are because their various funders actually require that they report as part of their grants or as part of the contracts that they have in terms of them receiving their funding. But what we do find is that actually once you know, I do a lot of training with smaller organisations, that actually once they come along to the training, you know, my acid test for whether we've done a good training session is when somebody goes away and says, you know, actually that's not so bad, and actually this IATI stuff is actually quite straightforward. So, you know, we would certainly want smaller and particularly non-profits to publish wherever we can. We do recognise, you know, it is an additional reporting requirement, but also as well we would say, you know, it is a voluntary standard, so we don't necessarily need you to publish everything. You know, sometimes just being able to publish perhaps the core of what you do or a subset of what you do, you know, is good enough. And actually we always say to our publishers that that's the best way to start, is just by publishing perhaps a small amount of data, a subset of data. We don't expect everything to be perfect and complete, you know, the very first time you publish. You know, it's very much an evolution. So I hope that goes a little way to reassuring you, Dale.
Yes. Can I also ask, if one goes to the website, can a person from the public find out which nonprofits or public agencies are reporting?
Yes, if you go to the IATI registry, which was on, I think, the second slide of this pack, if you go to that link, you can see a list of all of the organisations that are currently publishing. So there's just over 500 at the moment, so of which a fair number, and it does have their organisation type next to them as well, so you'll be able to see who's publishing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Wendy, we had a question from Emily Troutman. Hi, Emily, and she'd like very much to know whether any of the sessions from the meeting in Tanzania from the TAG will be broadcast live for people to watch. I don't think so, but I'm sure there's going to be some follow-up from that.
Yeah, I don't believe it is going to be any live broadcast. There'll certainly be lots of live tweeting and the like, but unfortunately, I think it was more of a logistical, I think it was looked into, but unfortunately the logistics it wasn't able to do on this particular tag, but hopefully in future tags we'll be able to do that.
Great. And I don't think we have any more questions for the moment. That's fine. We can move on.
Okay.
And please keep them coming. Just pop them in the question box, and we'll pick them up and come back to them at the end of the next session.
Okay, thanks, Liz. Right, everyone, I'm just going to move on and just do a very brief talk now about publishing tools and the support for those tools. So there's essentially three main ways of publishing, as I think we saw at the beginning of the webinar session. So we have tools that relate to manual input. So there is a tool called AidStream. Again, the link is on that earlier slide. It's been developed and is provided by Young Innovations, which is a software house based in Nepal, who have been involved with IATI pretty much from the start. And this is great for, following up from Dale's question, for small organisations or even medium-sized organisations. If you've only got a handful of projects that you need to publish on, then AidStream is perfect for that. It's free, it's online, so you can go onto the tool, create an account, and start publishing within the hour essentially. You can just type your information in, and you can also link your AidStream account through to your registry account, so that AidStream handles all that sort of timely and the manual part that you would otherwise have to do of updating your registry account. So AidStream's great for that. In terms of the next sort of step up from that is there is the possibility of doing a CSV file input. So it might be that you can pull out the data from your various IT systems, and whilst you may not have the resources initially to get your IT department or to write you a shiny new application that does all the publishing for you, you maybe can get that information into a CSV file. And then there are a couple of products or tools that are available where you can basically upload that CSV file and map it to the fields that the columns in your CSV file relate to. So map those columns to the fields in the IATI Standard. So there may be some people on the call already who already use the CSV converter. So this was a tool that was again produced in the early days of IATI. It's only currently publishes at version 103, which isn't much good if you want to use the humanitarian elements now that we've obviously been featuring and is a key part of humanitarian publishing. And I also want to take the opportunity to say that this particular tool will be due for decommissioning in 2018. And the reason for it being decommissioned is because AidStream is now they've been working on a CSV import themselves, so effectively the functionality is replicated, and AidStream does output at version 202. You can report at version 202 via AidStream, and also there may be other tools that are being developed across the sort of IATI community to use CSV. So the CSV converter has sort of had its day, it's on its last legs now, so we're certainly encourage any new publishers not to use that particular tool, but to look at the features in AidStream initially. And similarly, of course, you may have, if you perhaps in a larger organization, you might have the luxury of being able to have a bespoke publishing application. So this is where your IT department, as I mentioned earlier, produce an in-house application that pulls all the data out of your systems, formats it up into the XML format required by the IATI Standard, and then updates automatically the IATI registry. So, and if there's any sort of technical buffs on on this session as well, just to let you know that the IATI registry is underpinned. It uses a product called CCAN. So in terms of how you would update the registry, there is a public API to the CCAN technology, so your developers would need to use that in terms of updating the IATI registry details. And this is just a quick screen print here, really, just to show you what AidStream looks like. So it was upgraded in the last year or so. It's been made a lot easier to use and a lot more intuitive now. And then I know that Young Innovations as well are looking at things as producing wizards, and they've provided some online help. There's an online help resource on the AidStream website as well to really help users in terms of using the tool. And they are constantly, obviously, managing the tool and looking to improve it all the time. And similarly, just for the bespoke, just saying a little bit more about if your organisation wants to produce its own publishing application, there is a little bit of information about that registry API and various signposts and links and signposting to where you can find out more information about the CCAN API that you would need to do that. Okay, any questions on tools?
We've got a previous question, and I think it's kind of leading us into the next session, from Frédéric. I don't know if you can unmute Frédéric.
Let me find Frédéric too. Yep. Hi, Frédéric. Can you hear us? Hello, Frédéric. Can you hear us? I can't hear Frédéric. Do you want to say what the question is?
Yes,
then, Liz?
I'll say the question. So how does reporting in IATI mesh with reporting on progress for the World Humanitarian Summit commitments through PACT? Do these data banks speak to each other, or are they separate? And do you see IATI gaining prominence given the summit transparency commitment? So how does IATI mesh with reporting on the sort of, when I think Frédéric's talking about PACT, is the independent process of monitoring commitments that were made at the summit. So we are going to cover that a little bit in the next session. I think, grand bargain signatories will be required to provide information on how they are going to meet the grand bargain commitment on transparency, and that is very much linked to the to the extent to which they're going to be publishing to IATI, and we'll be talking about how that might be monitored going forwards. In terms of the data bands, and of course IATI data could potentially, once it's being published, be used to enable monitoring of other commitments. For example, there's a commitment, I think, on the percentage of funding that goes to local or national responders. So that's something that IATI could potentially speak to, but may require further enhancements of the standard. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Lindy.
Only to say I'd very much agree, obviously, with all what you just said, Liz, and to say I suspect that IATI will have more prominence, I think. As Liz has sort of indicated there, we are getting a lot of inquiries from people now who are starting to look at IATI as a mechanism in terms of to support all sorts of monitoring. Certainly for the grand bargain, it's very much central to the transparency work stream and others. But actually, it's even wider. A lot of initiatives that are going on, and a lot of sort of organisation-specific initiatives where they have data requirements. They're now starting to look at using IATI as a source for, their own monitoring. So yes, I think we've very much got to the point with IATI that we now have so much data that it is essentially, useful and is there to be used. And I think that is now being recognised. So yeah, I think it's definitely it's only going to increase, I think, both in terms of publishers and data use.
Shall we move on?
Okay.
Wendy, I can't see any more questions so far. Oh, hang on, no, sorry, wait. We have got a couple of questions through. So before we just go into monitoring, there's Esther who said, how does the IATI reporting link with systems such as Activity Info and ACVO Flow? I'm not sure if you're able to respond to that.
I'm not sure about the first one. I'm not sure that unless they're using IATI data. I mean, one of the things about IATI data is it is in the public domain, so any software developer can take the data and use it. They don't have to ask our permission. They don't have to tell us they're using it. So quite frequently we come across new applications, or people make us aware of new applications to say, oh, it's using IATI data. What was the second one? It was
ACVO Flow.
ACVO. So ACVO themselves have their own product, which you can also, is actually another publishing tool. I think it's ACVO RSR. So certainly they have a product base that also publishes, and I think uses IATI data as well. So essentially you publish the data, and then I think there are various products within their product set that allow you to visualize or monitor or use the data. So yeah, ACVO has certainly been, again, early sort of adopters of using and of IATI data.
And we'll just take one final question from Emily. Maybe we can unmute Emily, and she's got a question about recipient country.
Okay. Hi, Emily.
Hi, great. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, my question was just to be clear about the definitions for recipient country, where you were going over it before. Recipient country just means actually where the activity took place, right? It doesn't mean that that country actually received any actual funding.
No, it does relate to where the actual project was delivered, yeah, where it took place. That's right. Okay. I mean, so generally that is where the funding will probably end up in that country, or some funding will end up in that country.
But presumably, like, program officers could count their own salaries as, you know, something that took place in that country but didn't go to that country, right?
I mean, yes, it depends how they report it, I guess, really. I mean, obviously, you could show staff costs as an expenditure against the project.
Right.
You can as well, I mean, with recipient country, I mean, it is a detail, but you can actually also record recipient country at the level of transaction. So if you wanted to get into the detail of actually showing where the money was and whether it was in country or whether it wasn't, you can report that level of detail through the transaction, so by reporting recipient country at transaction level. But that's quite detailed. Only some of our more advanced publishers would do that at the moment, but it can be done.
Okay, great, thank you.
Okay, thanks, Emily.
Wendy, should we move on? We've got,
okay.
I think we've just got under 8 minutes. We need to get through the rest of the presentation. So I'll crack on the kind of monitoring section. And here you can see it was Carly Fiorina, she's a former CEO, President and Chair of Hewlett-Packard, who way back in 2004 said that the goal is to turn data into information and information into insight. So it's not about publishing data as an end in itself, but about being able to use that data and turn it into information to help us understand what's going on and to take better decisions. And we need good data to measure our performance, to see whether we're meeting the objectives we set ourselves and how efficiently and effectively we've done this. And if not, to make the necessary changes. We need good data to learn how to do things better. But monitoring and making the results of that monitoring public is also an important tool for organizational accountability. It can increase trust by donors, supporters and partners in an organization's performance, and ultimately it could, and we think should, empower those receiving aid, affected populations, to make more informed decisions and choices. And I think it's also important to stress here that monitoring shouldn't be seen as a tick box or compliance exercise, which unfortunately it often is. The real value is when there's ownership of the monitoring process and organisations are involved as part of a dialogue on how to improve performance, and when of course they act on the information provided. So on the next slide, we'll take a brief look at a number of transparency and accountability monitoring initiatives, and there are an increasing number of them that are building on emerging evidence that transparency is essentially a precondition for improving service delivery and accountability, and who are monitoring progress in this area. The Open Government Partnership, or OGP, is a multi-stakeholder initiative which has an independent monitoring process to assess the extent that governments meet their commitments to making themselves more open and accountable and responsive to citizens. Open Budget Survey, it's managed by the International Budget Partnership. They assess budget transparency, participation and oversight in over 100 countries around the world. Many of you may be familiar with the Global Partnership for Effective Development Corporation's monitoring framework, which tracks progress in implementing their aid effectiveness principles, one of which is greater transparency and accountability. And also with Publish What You Fund's Aid Transparency Index, and that's an annual independent review to track and rank the progress by donors in making their aid transparent. And just to highlight here that both Publish What You Fund and the Global Partnership are using organisations' IATI data to inform their assessments. Now on the next slide you'll see that IATI is supporting publishers by providing a variety of statistics on the quality of their IATI data, and this is with an online dashboard which is also publicly available. And this kind of ensures that there's a consistent approach in the presentation of statistics in IATI's annual report, the Global Partnership's monitoring framework, and the dashboard's own nightly calculations. So the dashboard uses a system of flags, red, amber and yellow, where the IATI technical team has identified a data quality issue for a specific publisher. And this dashboard's generated nightly from the IATI data on the registry that Wendy mentioned previously, and it's maintained by the IATI technical team. So let's see a little bit more about the dashboard and IATI's 4 data quality dimensions. So timeliness looks at how often the data is updated and how up to date it is. And essentially organisations should be updating their data on a monthly or a quarterly basis, and many organisations are currently doing this. Comprehensiveness examines how complete the data published is. So for example, the extent to which organisations are publishing current data for the core elements of the standard that Wendy mentioned previously, sort of basic fields such as title and description, activity date, sector and country. Whether they're publishing current financial data, such as the reporting of commitments and spending, whether it's possible to track funds across activities and organisations, whether organisations are publishing the what we call the added value elements of the standard, such as the geocoordinates, activity documents, information on results. The coverage dimension shows what proportion of an organisation's total output is published through IATI. For each publisher, the total spend published to the standard for a given year is compared with an external source. And finally, the forward-looking dimension compares the number of activities published to IATI with budgets reported for each year against the total number of activities current at the start of the year. And this is done for the current year and the next 2 years. Let's move on to the Grand Bargain project and the monitoring that we're going to be doing. So the big question here is the Grand Bargain Transparency Commitment talks about publishing timely, transparent, harmonised and open high-quality data on humanitarian funding. What makes for good quality IATI data on humanitarian financing? What would the data quality dimensions look like? So, for example, some dimensions may remain the same, such as comprehensiveness and coverage, but there may be arguments that forward-looking data, information on more predictable multi-year funding is less common, more difficult to publish in a humanitarian context, or that regarding timeliness, maybe data should be updated as close to real time as possible in the case of fast onset emergency situations. You can imagine that. Or the ability to track funding from agencies to national and local responders, referring back to a previous question, is that particularly important? We'd like to hear your views. And that's why we are consulting with Grand Bargain signatories on the monitoring the Grand Bargain commitment on the next slide. And basically, we want to find out what you think should be the essential elements of high-quality humanitarian aid data, how you think the standard should be enhanced or enriched to ensure that it meets and continues to meet the needs of the humanitarian community. So to support Grand Bargain signatories in monitoring their progress, in meeting this, the greater transparency commitment. We'll be working with the Grand Bargain workstream on transparency and the wider humanitarian and the IATI communities to develop a monitoring methodology and an online dashboard to support this process. That's over March to May 2017. We're planning our first consultation meeting at a side event to the ICVA annual general meeting on the 29th of March in Geneva, and hope that many of you will be able to come along and share your views. We're also planning a similar event in New York at the end of April. Then over the period March to May, we'll be adapting and testing the IATI dashboard, and at the end of this phase in May 2017, we'll be publishing a baseline assessment with recommendations on proposed improvements to the standard for humanitarian activities and a kind of roadmap for the way forward. We hope to begin monitoring from the 1st of June 2017 and have planned 2 snapshot monitoring reports for October 2017 and February 2018, with a final report in May 2018. So I've kind of run through that maybe a little bit too quickly, but are there any further questions? Have we got any more, Wendy?
No, I don't think we've got any new questions.
Susan?
Maybe it's a good thing. Susan
is asking us about, do you want to?
Yeah.
Got quite a lot of questions on training and aid stream.
Yeah. Do you want to read the question out, Liz?
Yes. So in terms of guidance, do you offer trainings for new publishers starting to publish data on IATI? For larger organizations, can one only use bespoke, or will it be possible to publish on aid stream? That's for larger organizations. She looked into this last year, and the feedback was that aid stream may not be able to accommodate an organization with lots of activities. Mm-hmm. Is this the case, or is there a way this can be published? Aid stream's easy on the eye and much easier to navigate. Well, that's good to hear.
Yeah, I'll start with that first then. Yeah, I mean, AidStream was essentially designed and implemented really as a manual input tool. Obviously, you'll be able to, you know, it's being enhanced so it has the CSV import feature, but really you wouldn't want to use AidStream probably for more than, say, 500 activities at the moment. I think it would just be really, really difficult to use for anything more than that. So it does tend to mean that, you know, larger organizations, we do end up working with them to get them to, you know, to publish their stuff automatically. However, we are always working with the IATI community, you know, and we know that there are other software houses and other developers looking at this sort of middle ground really to try and find some better tools to help those sort of in the, you know, who are in the middle, who are perhaps not the largest and don't have huge amounts of resources, but, you know, obviously have too many activities for it to be done manually or even through the CSV import. So that is an issue, you know, we are aware of, one we'll carry on working on. In terms of training, for anyone in the UK, we work with Bond, the NGO umbrella organisation, who provide training sessions on a monthly basis. You can book onto their training. But other than that, we're not currently doing any sort of major training beyond that at the moment. But obviously, if there is a demand, then that's obviously something that we could look to do. In the past, what we have done sort of bespoke sessions for groups of organisations or those that are located in the same area or region or whatever. So it can be done. It's really on a sort of case-by-case basis at the moment. But I think, again, as IATI continues to grow, we'll have to look at providing sort of more formal training sessions and how we can extend the support that's currently available.
Wendy, we have a question from Martin, who asks, what is the signing date you're using for the 2-year commitment of the Grand Bargain? Well, I mean, the Grand Bargain, as I understand, was agreed at the summit. So that's the summit in May 2016. So we're coming up to, in May 2017, close up to 1 year. But obviously recognise that progress is going to be gradual. That's the That's the specific date, I think, that's in the commitment. So 2 years from the summit, which was May 2016, would be to May 2018. I hope that answers your question. We've no more questions, Wendy, at the moment. Do we want to crack on with the final?
Yeah. Conscious of time.
Conscious of time, yes, and thank you everybody for staying with us in the last 5 minutes. So next, in terms of next week, next steps. Next week we'll be sending out a recording of this webinar and the slides, and posting them on the Development Initiative's website. With you can see at the bottom of the page, more details can be found at. That's the link. Feel free, please, to join, as Wendy mentioned, the IATI Community Discuss Forum, and we've posted the link there for you, where users and publishers get together to discuss technical issues and data needs. So please do join. Always grateful for new participants. We'll also be sending out an online survey to Grand Bargain signatories to get your views on the challenges and incentives for publishing to IATI from within your own organisations, as well as details of the upcoming consultation workshop that we mentioned. And that's all from us, really. Thank you once again for joining, and please do get in touch with any further queries or questions. You can find our contact details in the original webinar invite. Wendy, any more from you?
No, just to say thank you very much for listening, and I'm glad you were able to join us today.
Thank you.